this room is called the Grain Exchange, and it was a room built in 1876 to be a space of business, and businessmen wanted to work in a very comely space. So the city father, or the person who organized this building, was Alexander Mitchell. Alexander Mitchell first came to Milwaukee as a Scottish immigrant, and he came to Milwaukee first as worked as a clerk in what was then an insurance company that later was really banking. And from the money he was making in the banking business as he worked up, during the Civil War, Milwaukee became a major graining center. And the grain would come from the hinterlands into the port of Milwaukee and then was shipped east. And Mitchell invested in the graining business. And after the Civil War, he then took his money and turned it into financing railroads in the state of Wisconsin. He actually hoped that Wisconsin would become a major railroad center, larger than what later became Chicago's railroad center. But from some of the money that Mitchell made, he decided he really wanted to translate it into buildings. So first he had Mix, the famous architect or the one he was making famous, the fellow who came from Connecticut. He first hired him to do the bank building next door. Then after that exquisite building went up, he then hired Mix to build this wonderful grain exchange building. The name on the outside of the building says Chamber of Commerce. And in the 19th century, a Chamber of Commerce was not the ad man that it is today, but you can understand that in a chamber in which commerce is done, it would bring people to the city. So this room was designed inside this huge 1879 building, and it was appointed with all these wonderful elements, columns and decorative stenciling, and in the center of the room was a major segment with risers put up in a circle so that the bidding could go on for the grain that was going to be transacted here in the building, in this room. And around the edges there would have been tables at certain times of the year with grain examples that they could pick up, and I understand that there were businessmen that would look kind of powdery as they would test out certain grains. But this was the major business room for Wisconsin, and on the risers the men would stand, and I understand they would put up their fingers to bid 2, 3 on the graining business. And then of course later on, when they were needing some sustenance, they would then walk out of the building and go 2 blocks over to the Milwaukee Club, which was also a building built by Mix in 1881 or 1883 rather, and then they would have their luncheon there and then repair back here for further business. After the graining room was no longer needed, as we moved into the 20th century, this room then became unnecessary. And so eventually, believe it or not, it became a storage space. And once again, a false ceiling was dropped, and later on, and I saw this in the late 1970s, that it was just really an abandoned room that was used for storage. And then at that point, there were some forces at work. I remember coming here with some students from the local university, and a professor was bringing them up to the 5th floor men's room, and we could look out from the men's room and see that there was still stencil work, etc., on the ceiling, but nobody knew it was there, and it was not in bad shape, but it needed to be repaired. At that point, the person who owned the building, Mrs. Ashley and Mr. Ashley, owned the building across the street. They owned this one, and they owned the bank building next door. And so they had already started to restore the building across the street. And I can say that I was, at that point, the Ashleys had already taken out the old false ceiling, and they had started to see about some restoration work. But we were, the historic preservation group I help with now, Historic Milwaukee Incorporated, decided to have a reception in this room, and it was, you know, there were no lights in here. It was completely empty at that point, but we found a lot of people wanted to come and see what this room had once been like without all the restoration work. And we were giving a tour next door. I was giving a little walking tour, and Mrs. Ashley showed up on that walking tour in the building where she had already done some work. And I remember she stood on the staircase and she looked at me, and I was talking about, you know, the possibilities here, and she looked at me and she said, do you really think if we fixed that room up, people would use it? And she said, you young people, you see things my friends wouldn't see. And I remember thinking at the time, yes, Mrs. Ashley, I think this room could become something. Well, of course, it really has. And through the powers of Mrs. Ashley and her husband, and then some other forces here, this room has been restored and now has become a banquet space. People have had their weddings here. It's you can rent it out. And in the meantime, it tells the story of a wonderful space and the history of downtown Milwaukee.
Watch American Artifacts every Sunday at 8 a.m., 7 p.m., and 10 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 3.